Alright guys, so I have been thinking about it a lot and I decided to make a video called The Worst Gear I've Ever Owned. Now for context, let's keep in mind that I started playing guitar when I was 13, so I'm 29 now, I'll be 30 in June, and in those days, this was before the internet and before YouTube and before really I had exposure to forums. So some of the decisions I made early on in my guitar playing and some of the gear that I bought was a little questionable. They weren't well thought out. They were, I was kind of at the mercy of, guitar magazine publications, Musician's Friend magazines, and yeah, I'm a huge fan of gear. I've owned a lot of gear, I've owned a lot of guitars, owned a lot of pedals, etc. And so I'm just gonna run through kind of the highlight reel over the last, 16 years, some of the worst gear that I've ever owned. Hopefully you take something away from this, and sometimes the gear itself wasn't bad, it was the context I was trying to use it, and I'd be surprised what I could do with some of this stuff today, given the chance. So let's get into it. What are these pieces of gear that were the worst gear I've ever owned? And let's start right at the very beginning. It's probably the first thing I bought for myself. I was 13 years old, I was playing in my first band with my friends, and I needed a distortion pedal. Now, where I was playing at my church at the time, we had access to some combo amps that ran clean, but the distortion channels were just terrible. They were outright terrible. We just couldn't dial in a good sound. And so I went to Guitar Center and I said, I'm getting a distortion pedal. And right there on the counter on clearance or something was a DOD death metal. Now, if you've heard of the Digitech death metal, the black casing and the red lettering, that's a different pedal. But they are almost identical in circuit, and today the DOD death metal is actually quite collectible. Now, if you're not familiar, it has volume, bass, mid, and treble, and no gain knob. The gain knob is automatically turned to 11. And it's quite mid-scooped and fizzy. And I got my pedal home, and as it turned out, that DOD death metal that was on clearance did not work. So I convinced my dad to take me all the way back to Guitar Center, which is about an hour-plus drive from where we lived at the time, and replace it, and I got the Digitech death metal, which did not sound good. I had it for quite a while. I don't even think I had a power adapter for the longest time. I was running it on 9-volt batteries. It's very difficult to dial in a good sound on. The only benefit that it had is that it had a line out and a simulated line out, and the simulated line out sounded okay with headphones for what it was. I mean, it's just a really gainy distortion pedal. It was very poorly suited to what I was doing, kind of a pop punk thing. And another piece of gear, that was one of the worst pieces of gear that I've ever owned, was a used Banshee, Rocktron Banshee talk box. Now, if you're not familiar with what a talk box is, it's a big metal box about like this big that has an amp and a speaker built in it. Not all do, but this one does have an amp and a speaker built into this large steel box, and it shoots the sound from a tiny speaker up through this tube into your mouth. So you're playing your guitar into this device, and the sound comes into your mouth, and you shape it out into a microphone. So the sound of the amp is literally rattling your teeth as you're playing guitar, and you've got this tube. It's about a half-inch tube, plastic tube in your mouth, and you're forming it to make the sounds. And it is one of the grossest things over time that you can ever use. Now, I talked to friends about this since, and I just mentioned that I thought this was probably one of the worst pieces of gear of all time. It's just the nastiness of that tube. I mean, you can rinse it in water, you can run it through Listerine. It's still gross. You look really weird when you do it, kind of dumb. It looks like, best case scenario, it looks like you're smoking a pipe, but it doesn't really look like that. And it's just all around, it was a mess. I got it for free. I ended up selling it on Craigslist for 75 bucks to someone who really wanted it. There was this really popular video at the time, it was probably 15, 16, of a guy that was playing a keyboard and running it through a talk box to make some kind of vocal-esque sounds that was really popular, and a lot of people went out and bought these things. Not a great piece of gear. And my methodology for picking up pedals amounted to this. So I'd walk into the Guitar Center, and I'd see the big glass used case of pedals, and I would just look for things that I knew were a bargain. So maybe I had messed with them, Boss pedals, etc. I'd messed with them, but I just didn't know that much about them, and I would just buy them, you know, on blown out, on used or clearance or whatever I could get my hands on. So sometimes I would rock away with some things that were just not great. One of those would be a Seymour Duncan tweak fuzz. Now, to be fair, I'm sure that with mods and with tweaking this, the tweak fuzz could be very useful. It's honestly one of the most well-built pedals I'd ever owned. Just the construction was really solid, it was bulletproof, but it just sounded really weird and thin and nasally. And there was, I believe it was a Guitar Player magazine video of Blue Saraceno, who it was designed for, playing it, and it sounded great on that video, and I never got anything resembling a good sound out of that pedal. And it wasn't super cheap, and yeah, it just doesn't sound good. I've seen other people have been doing mods on it now, and they get a very useful sound out of it, but yeah, honestly, one of the worst pieces of gear, and I think I read a good review on it in a magazine. Like, I was all excited about this thing, and it just was not good. Likewise, keeping in that same mode of pedals, I once bought a Washburn distortion pedal that was a Scott Ian signature distortion pedal. I don't know where I got it. It was in a clear blister pack. This was like wrapped in plastic. I might have paid $30 or $40 for it. And it had some cool, like the idea of it was cool. It was like volume, tone, and distortion. I think it had boost, and it had like a weird like blend of clean with the distorted signal, but it was just very thin and weird sounding, and it wasn't good. Another one of those things, just kind of an impulse buy, thinking it would do something, take it home, not good. And there's definitely plenty more of those than I can even remember. You know, looking back, I think one that I thought sounded good, but I just never could quite dial in right, was the Boss AC2 acoustic simulator. Again, this is one of those things. Now I probably could get a more usable sound out of it, but it was very mushy. For me, looking back today, maybe I could get a sound out of it if I was more careful. Guitars. The worst guitar I have ever owned was, I don't know if anyone remembers this, a few people that are older might. VW did a promotion where every brand new VW Bug or what have you that you bought that year, you got a First Act guitar made by VW, like it's VW branded First Act guitar. Now, First Act Custom Shop was actually some really well-built, high-end custom shop guitars, but most people know them as the cheap starter guitars at Walmart. They sold the name, Walmart bought them out and made really sometimes terrible instruments. So this was a little better than the Walmart instruments. I saw the ad on Craigslist. I had been aware of the whole campaign. They got a lot of celebrities tied into it. What was cool about the guitar is it did have a built-in amp, and it had really good sounding pickups. Well, anyway, I bought mine used like 3 or 4 years after the promotion, and it was owned by non-guitar players. They just threw it up on Craigslist for $50 during the recession. And I went out and bought it because I was like, oh, I can flip this, because I used to be big into Craigslist flipping. The fretboard had dried out so bad, some of the frets were coming out, and it scraped really badly. Like the neck itself was just kind of a dud. And I ended up flipping it for $150. It did have some cool features, but it was probably the worst guitar I've ever played as far as something that I personally owned. And I didn't own it very long. I owned it for about 2 weeks or less. And I flipped it, got rid of it. That was a done deal. I didn't buy a lot of amps. Just over the course of my life, I haven't owned a ton of amps. I've owned a few, and more so on the pedal side. And when I got into digital stuff, I did that. But probably one of the worst amp purchases I ever made was I bought a used Spider Valve, which has kind of had a resurgence as being a good amp. It's the Bogner Line 6 tube power amp, digital preamp collab that they did a few years ago. Right, and I bought the 100-watt tube head and 412 cabinet, and I had it in my house, and my intent was to use it for like practicing. Yeah, I had it for maybe a couple weeks, or if that, and I took it back and I said, this thing is not good. It really sounded quite terrible at low volumes, and I don't know if it was the cab that was with it. I don't know if it was one of the good cabs. I think it might have been like a cheap Spider cab matched with the nice head. So it just was a terrible combination, terrible for what I was using it for. It's probably the worst amp I've ever owned. Another one that's surprising because it wasn't cheap, and it had a lot of potential is my Ibanez Jake Bowen 7-string. Now, I'm a huge fan of Periphery. I'm a huge fan of what Jake Bowen does in the band, and I know that some of his other guitars are nicer. There was a lot of hype surrounding the release of his signature, and because it had his signature pickups, it was built for, you know, gent music. It was an extended range 7-string. It had a lot of cool features to it. I got it, and it sounded great. Now, honestly, genuinely, those pickups sounded very good for a 7-string. But it had some real QC issues. I don't know what happened, and it probably was fixable, at least this first part. So it had really nice binding on it. The finish was perfect. The neck felt perfect, but just everything about the neck and the fretboard was not great. So the frets weren't particularly polished. I don't know how this happened. I don't know if the compounds they were using or the process. Like the frets were like permanently stained somehow, like stained, and they were kind of dirty. And so I, you know, attempted to polish them up a little bit, but it really never, frets never felt great. I don't know how else to explain. I wish I had pictures to back it up, but so I had that. The bridge from the factory. Now I had a very early run one. To Ibanez's credit, these were supposed to come from the factory in drop G sharp tuning, and it was a Floyd. So it was probably a huge hassle for them to set it up. Now mine from the factory, the Floyd bridge, the intonation screws, which were already like made of cheap metal and not particularly well machined themselves, they were stripped out, and it was very, very difficult to adjust the intonation on the guitar because it was really far out. From the factory it was far out, and I can never seem to get it intonated correctly, especially for that tuning, which is what I wanted to play the Periphery guitar. Tried a bunch of different stuff with setup, never could get it to play good. Just everything about the action and the bridge was really terrible. Honestly, like you would pick hard on the low string and the bridge itself would actually bend, not like a Floyd, like it's supposed to move, like I had it locked down tight, and the bridge metal would be bending with the note. There's just a lot of quality issues with that particular guitar, and I wasn't alone in that. I wish I could take back some of the things I said in my review because it really did feel and sound good. I made a demo video the day I got it before digging in deep. I was like, oh, we'll sort all this out later. It was a bear. It was a bear to set up. It just, I don't know. I sold it. I don't know if it ever kind of redeemed itself. I had other friends that had ones that had issues with them. I have a video on my channel reviewing this pedal, and it's cheap, so it gets a little bit of a pass because of its inexpensive nature, but it is probably the noisiest and worst sounding cheap delay I've ever owned. Is the Tom's Line ADL1, I believe it's called, and it was supposed to be like an analog voice digital delay, and it functioned. Like, especially at the shorter times, it wasn't a terrible sounding delay, but it just was very noisy. The switch would engage intermittently. I think it was something I bought off Wish. It was like one of the first things I bought off Wish. I only bought a handful of pedals off Wish, and I don't recommend it. Buy off eBay or Amazon, you're getting a lot better deal. Another thing I bought off Wish that did really poorly was the Moon looper, and I didn't even make a video on this. I barely even told anybody that I had it. I think I got it for $37 or $38. It was off Wish. I see these floating around as an alternative looper to some of the other stuff on the market, but this particular run, this particular unit was not good how it worked. So a lot of these loopers that are small, it's a multi-function foot switch. So the foot switch does a bunch of things. It does stop, start, you hold to record, you like do a double tap to overdub, something like that. There's just a lot of commands that you put in with your foot to make it work. It was like impossible to time with the pedal. I looked into it. Some people said they resolved it. Some people said they didn't. My plan was to just return it and get another unit, but I had tossed the return paperwork from Wish, and so I couldn't return it. I ended up giving it to a friend. And it's one of the worst pieces of gear I've ever had. The bummer is it had a lot of potential. It had up to 5 minutes of recording time or something. It had a little flash card in it that could record quite a bit. It had some cool features, but just the functionality, what it was intended to do, it did not do well. So what I ended up using is I would record like a long section, and then it would have enough time to repeat itself and I could solo over it or whatever. And that was, you know, about a year ago. I was doing stuff like that back when I was in the garage because I didn't have a computer yet. And it's just always buyer beware on used sites like Craigslist, OfferUp, whatever your local one is. You know, there can always be that time where somebody scams you or sells you something broken and you have no recourse. And that's really unfortunate. But I hope you enjoyed this video. I wouldn't mind doing another one of these. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and share this video. It would really help my channel. I'm trying to break that 1K subs, and thanks for hanging out. See you next time.